Oh, wait. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 37 of the Future of Work show, where we discuss ideas that are playing a role in influencing the creation of a new future of work. Now, across different episodes this whole past year, we featured a variety of different ideas, right from the impact technology is going to have around the way we work to the changing ideas around leadership, culture, and organization. As some of you know, I'm the founder of Uncube, where I, along with my co founder Papia, work with organizations to help build the new workplaces of tomorrow, what we would like to call Workplace 2.0. And along with partnering with organizations in designing this new Workplace 2.0, we also offer education and advisory services around managing in the hybrid workplace. So before we get started on today's show, one quick announcement from me. Uncube and Harappa Education have partnered to create a digital-only program on managing in the hybrid workplace, and that's going to be out in just a few weeks. It's a really good program. It's a great place to go if you want to educate a large number of managers in your organization on how to manage in what's going to be a dramatically different workplace. So with that introduction, let's get started on the topic of today. Is the future of work going to be more transparent? And I'm going to introduce you to two amazing women, Amber and Ariella. Amber is actually going to be joining us in just a few minutes, but I'm going to give you their introduction. And with that, I'm welcoming Ariella onto the show. Hi, Ariella.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Thank you so much. So Ariella and Amber are the founders of Lioness, which is a New York-based media company that does something which is quite unusual and has been creating waves around the world. So their work was recently featured in the New York Times because what they do is they help people who have faced misconduct, abuse, harassment at work tell their stories. Now, as many of us are aware, many organizations across the world have NDAs, which make such disclosure actually rather tricky. So Amber and Ariella work with people who have faced misconduct, harassment, abuse, and help them tell their stories in the public in a way that doesn't hurt them and yet helps to bring about change. And in today's conversation, we're going to dive right in and try and understand what are some of the ideas and ways with which Lioness works. So with that, Ariella, my first question, I know that I've seen in your career trajectory, you have spent a lot of time trying to help both organizations and individuals tell their story. And from whatever I've read about your work, you seem to have a special preference for helping people who are in need tell their stories in ways that are generally accessible only to the most powerful and well-connected executives. So can you share a little bit about what was your motivation when you were setting up Lioness?
Sure. So my background is actually in, as you mentioned, public relations for larger companies and organizations, largely in the tech world. And as I was building my career in that realm, I really started to understand just how powerful narrative is and how important it was for these companies to hire experts in this field to help them control the narrative and manage their reputations. And years in, I thought to myself, what if this were more broadly democratized to people, to everyday people? Your average person obviously doesn't have the resources of a large company to shape a narrative in the press. But sometimes, as we're finding, especially with workplace issues, the court of public opinion is a lot more powerful in actually making change than the court of law. Because in the court of law, it's really a David versus Goliath battle, and that whoever has the most money usually ends up getting what they want. Even if they have to give a little bit of money to somebody to make them shut up. So I thought, what if we could provide this as a service to people who really needed it, who wanted to use the press as a means to change their workplace or change the culture. And we take a really journalistic approach to it as well, where we're kind of like middle women between the press and people. People come to us, we hear them out, we do have to do a bit of fact checking ourselves, because the press does lend a lot of legitimacy to somebody's story as opposed to just going to Twitter or Instagram and posting. You actually have to be vetted to get into the press. So we walk people through what that means, what kind of information they need to get together, and we help them bring that story forward with connections that I built over the years that I spent in tech PR. And I think it's powerful for people, to be able to shape the narrative and tell their story in their own words, or try to guide a reporter or a news organization toward a different perspective. And not a lot of people know how to do it. I mean, it's hard to tell your own story and to look inward and map that out for yourself. So we try to help people figure out how to do that.
That's really interesting. And I've heard you speak about the importance of telling a good story and how difficult it is for, most of us to understand what parts of our story are perhaps likely to connect, really well with the outside world. Are there any tips that you'd like to share around, what really creates an impact as a story? I mean, obviously a true story, and I know you vet it and you do your due diligence and make sure that whatever is being shared is factually correct. But are there some general guidelines that go into making a story connect?
Yeah, I think as it relates to the workplace specifically, because I know that this conversation is more about the workplace, you do need to have evidence. So if you're to say, this manager said this to me, or this manager made these people feel this way, are there other people who can corroborate that? And they don't have to do it on the record with the journalist. They can just speak on background, which means that their names are not implicated. Do they have emails? Do they have Slack messages? Anything that shows, because what companies will try to do, especially if it's just one person, is paint that person as like the disgruntled former employee who potentially didn't fit in. I don't know if you read, there was an article in the New York Times a few weeks back about all of these women at Google who were speaking up about mistreatment. And they were basically just told, like, you need mental health counseling and the problem is on you, not the organization. And then they all sort of banded together and they were like, well, all of us have the same experience. So are all of us crazy? Or is it Google that's culturally problematic in some ways? So I think to be able to have corroboration in the form of other people or evidence, to look at it as clinically as you can, which can be hard because these are very emotional, high stakes situations. When you think about people's workplace issues, it goes straight to like their dignity and their entire purpose. So people do get very emotional, understandably, about it. But I would just urge people to be as clinical as possible, because that does lead to the best set of facts to help the journalists really understand what's happening. And of course, they can explain how it is that a situation made them feel and what it did to their lives. But I think just mapping out all the different facts and also, tethering it to what other people may be facing in other workplaces or what other people are facing in their own workplaces, I think is very powerful to show that it's a societal issue, a cultural issue, and not just some sort of spat between a manager and an employee. And if it is just that, I will say, if it's just like, oh, you have a bad boss who once said something mean to you, it's not newsworthy. There definitely has to be a broader trend, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of somebody enabling some sort of environment that's harming others, to make it newsworthy. But unfortunately, there are a lot of those situations that we're hearing of.
Those are some really good pointers, Ariella. I hear you speak about the importance of being clinical and factual. Then the importance of it establishing a trend or a pattern that isn't just about one individual's experience, but about, broader swath of the organization and how it connects. And I hear you speak about the importance of, bringing evidence, but also corroboration from many others who've experienced something like this, because that's what makes it then, a story worth telling, that it's not about an individual manager and an individual employee, but it's about a pattern within an organization. And, you spoke about Google, organizations like Google and many of the other organizations which have been in the news for similar reasons of the last few years are actually extremely powerful organizations with the kind of PR advisory machinery, legal advisory machinery that few individuals would probably have access to. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around, how does one sort of even the balance, given, just how much risk an individual takes when they're coming out and telling their story versus, really the stakes for an organization?
Oh, I mean, the risk for the individual is just so much higher from a financial and economic and social perspective. I mean, it's much, much easier just generally in life, just to fit in. And I think that for people who are taking that risk, a lot of times we get the question, like, just how risky is it? And there's really no way to game that out, because you don't know how, there's so many different ways the company could react. Worst case scenario, they do sue you if you've signed an agreement. We haven't really seen that happen, because usually the stories are so airtight that for the companies to then go ahead and sue this lone person, especially if they're like multi-billion-dollar companies, it's just a really bad look for the company. But, it's a financial risk, it's an emotional risk, it's a social risk, because that person is really going out on a limb to call out and expose something that's happening at an organization, and they don't know what that means for their career. And can they ever go back into that industry again if they're seen as a troublemaker? Can they recover financially from it? I do think that the people who we work with who decide to go forward, they're usually like extremely emotionally strong. Like, they have, whether they've been in therapy or talked to family and friends or have some sort of financial safety net, they have a lot of conviction in what they're doing. There's no wavering. It's not like, oh, but if I say it this way, could I maybe get a job at this company after I whistleblow? Like, it's usually like, I have conviction that this is what I want to say. And this is why I want to say it. And there's so many reasons for why that person is the way they are, how they were raised. Maybe it happened to them in past workplace experiences and they're just fed up. But yeah, it's a tremendous amount of risk. Whereas for the company, they have money. I mean, they have lots of money to pay law firms to defend them and, PR spin people to defend them. And it's not to say companies shouldn't be able to defend themselves. Like, just because you're powerful doesn't mean you shouldn't have the right to defend yourself, but you just have so much more money to be able to achieve that it's just like incredibly lopsided. And the way it works is that the individuals usually, or they try to squash, which may sound like a dramatic word, but I think they really do try to squash that individual and that dissent and paint it in whatever way they can as like, this person is a thorn in the side of the organization, a thorn in the side of progress, a troublemaker. There are tactics that they can use to discredit that person as well. So it's definitely scary stuff. It's not for the faint of heart. People who go and do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. And, if we just read our comments, Papia has joined in. Hi, Papia. And she speaks about how telling your story to the world required loads of courage, reactions from society and the workplace. And I have a follow-on question on this as well. The other observation is that there's a pattern of branding disgruntled employees as performance problem cases, where performance issues might actually be arising because of the organizational climate itself. So is that something you see quite often? That
there's something there's something called a performance improvement plan that a lot of HR departments will use to, like, if somebody is being troublesome, they'll this person could be very intelligent and contributed a lot to the organization, but the HR departments will essentially say, like, you are a low performer, and they'll give you some sort of unreasonable, like, milestones to make in order to keep your job. This actually happened to me once before, where they were like, you have a week to achieve what's in this plan. And I'd never in my life been put on a performance improvement plan before. I was like, what is going on? I think they just don't like me. But and like, that's a way to basically like show people the door and say, like, it's your performance issues. They don't want to admit what's really going on. So that is a good point.
Yeah, yeah. And, you spoke about how people who you work with have tons of courage. And you found that for reasons which are perhaps sometimes very personal, they are the ones who stay the course and, don't start doubting themselves despite the fact that it is so difficult. Let me ask you, are you seeing a shift in the way organizations respond to some of these allegations? For instance, with the Me Too movement, etc. Have there been shifts in organizations becoming more open to this feedback, or do you think we are pretty much where we've always been?
I think there's been progress. I think sometimes with the really large companies, it's hard because they don't really have an incentive to change, or they'll treat it in fluffy ways where they'll provide people with like very cushy salaries and benefits, which is like, it's not to say that that's not important either for employees, but they'll treat it that way as opposed to dealing with some of like the more entrenched issues that people might want to be talking about. But I think there has been some progress. I think that part of it is people are afraid, or companies are afraid of a reputational issue. So they know that this is a possibility, that employees can now come out, and that people are becoming more bold and breaking NDAs and non-disparagement agreements. And I think that that frightens companies, especially if they're very rich companies or rich people, because maybe they don't care about the money, but they care about their legacy. They really care about their legacy. So perhaps that is causing a change. But it really is coming. I think the change is coming from the outside. And it has to come from the outside, I believe. And then companies will either follow new policies that are formed as a result of that outside pressure, or outside press, and they will change. But I think it's incremental.
So I hear you saying that there have been some shifts. Obviously, there are also strong reasons for organizations to care a lot about the press that they receive, and individuals to care a lot about their own professional legacy. And it's those factors that are influencing organizations' responsiveness. And yet you are pointing out the fact that some of these shifts have to come from the outside. So I'm curious about your thoughts around, some of the legality. So, you spoke a little while back about the fact that so many employees sign non-disclosure agreements. Obviously, NDAs were set in for a very, very different purpose when they were started. It was to protect trade secrets and, sensitive organizational information, but they can often be used to, to make it very difficult for people to share some of their actual experiences. And we saw that in the Me Too movement in California, at least, there was some, amendments or new laws which allowed people to state factual information that happened, even if that went against their NDAs. Do you think that we're going to see more of that? That it is going to become more and more legally available for people to speak out against misconduct or abuse despite their NDAs?
I do think so. I mean, I think the California law is the first step, and there are so many companies headquartered in California, and that could have ramifications for their employees in other areas. I do think that some very progressive companies may even start to adopt language like this that isn't legally mandated or required for them, but they want to basically signal or telegraph to their employees that they care about these issues. So they're going to put more progressive clauses into their contracts. But I do think it's going to change because I think a lot of people are fed up. And it's not to say that corporate power will never, that will always be there and that will always be an interest. And of course, naturally, they sort of have to push back against the needs of every individual. But I think that in order to keep the peace with a lot of people who are demanding more autonomy and power and transparency, as this conversation is about in the workplace, companies will start to adopt some of these provisions into their, agreements with employees, or maybe they don't even have NDAs. The woman who's actually spearheading that legislation is a woman named Ifoma Ozoma, and her point is like, why do we even need NDAs? Can't we just have confidentiality clauses? And how weird is it and almost dystopian that you would sign a piece of paper that would almost, in a way, like forcibly erase part of your memory about an experience. How weird is that to basically, there in some of these agreements, you can't even share what happened to you or something that you observed to your spouse or your partner or your family. So I think her point in this entire campaign is kind of that this is strange. And there are other ways that we can address this to protect trade secrets and to protect competitive information. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are erasing parts of their memories or histories or backstories in order to progress through the workforce.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I think you make a very, very good point that it's California where some of these changes have originated, because California is home to, so many important tech companies and is often at the forefront of what maybe will follow across the world. So I think that's a really, really good point that you made. I was wondering, Ariella, what are your thoughts around do you think the future of work is going to be more transparent, just because it's really, really hard today to, squash views, given social media, etc. We have, of course, Glassdoor, for instance, where employees can, share their own experiences. There's another app called Volt, which perhaps you're also familiar with, where you can in real time record any abuse or harassment you are facing, and do it anonymously, and at least it gives you feedback on how many others have experienced something similar in your organization or or with your boss, perhaps. And of course, there is, for instance, the kind of work that you are doing. All of these seem to point towards a future where organizations understand that the future of work is way more transparent than any time in the past. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that there has always been a sort of whisper network about companies and organizations, and that has existed for a long time, even before some of these platforms sprung up. But I do think that these platforms and press and all of these labor movements definitely give more space for this information to be shared and formally shared, because before it was just sort of like, oh, did you hear about the CEO of such and such, and he really likes women or whatever. And it was a little bit more kind of people whispering to each other at the office. And now I think it's definitely becoming more above board, and people are being a little bit more honest about what's happening. I do think that with everything, if there's a shift toward transparency, companies are going to try and recalibrate that toward the center, where they're, of course, they don't want every single employee sharing every single piece of information about their performance reviews, their micro interactions with their managers or people who they work with. Like, that's like so much information that I think in their perspective, nothing would get done if we were all just talking about like what's behind the scenes all the time. So I think in response to like some of this hyper transparency, the companies will make an effort to find some middle ground. But I think it is better that people aren't living in like a shroud of secrecy in the workplace, and that we do find that middle ground where people are able to make decisions for themselves and know who they're working for, and um, what their company really stands for, while still being able to like function productively at work. So yeah, I do think that it is more transparent, and it's helpful to people, and like that will be some of the future for sure.
So I'm going to take a few questions. There's a
Okay.
question here. How do we make it aspirational for organizations to have a culture where power is not used against employees in any manner, creating a psychologically safe workplace?
Oh, if I could solve that, I'd get a Nobel Peace Prize, I'm sure. Um, I think that there are two ways, if I were to, and that's a really complicated question, but I think the first way is to like raise leaders who definitely are more empathetic than sociopathic, um, in the workplace. I think raising leaders who care about their people and are building something for the right reasons definitely fosters an environment that, it all comes from the top. If the top is very toxic, it's likely that like middle management, and upper management will be toxic as well. So I think cultivating those types of leaders. And then I also think enforcement mechanisms, right, for people who need to be enforced. Like sometimes power does corrupt. Like that's just human nature, that like as we accrue power, it can corrupt us. So there need to be enforcement mechanisms to make sure that people, if they do abuse their power, if they do overstep, that there's some recourse for the people that they're harming. So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
both of those strategies are really important to creating like a more humane
yeah.
environment, and leaders who really like respect people's humanity as opposed to just the bottom line. So that is important.
Now, that's a really great answer. And I think we're going to begin to see more and more of that as it becomes harder and harder to keep the lid on, misconduct or harassment of any kind. It's just not worth the cost for organizations to, take that chance with bad bosses, as you call them. So there's another question. Do you feel NDAs should be amended in organizations to allow for these conversations?
I do. I think what's happening in California makes a lot of sense, because I think that, you know, when people are being like, NDAs were not created to protect abuse and to protect harassment. And I do think that, especially as it relates to harassment, a lot of companies are changing and lifting people from, they're basically allowing people to talk about that if that's happened to them, even if they did sign an NDA. Um, but I think what's happening in California is a really good first step toward allowing people to talk about things that have happened without compromising the company's trade secrets, but also ensuring that they're able to write whatever happened, or at least be able to talk about it and move on from it. Because I do think that if you're suppressing all of these things, it all comes out in some form or fashion. And it can really harm people if they're unable to talk about these things. So I do think that NDAs will change because there's just such attention brought to them. And I also think that if they don't change, people will break them anyway. I really think that they
Yeah.
will. Not everyone, because different people have different appetites for risk. But I think if more and more people are breaking them, it's going to be harder
It's
for
yeah.
companies. Yeah.
I can see that it sets a different climate where
Mm-hmm.
it's just more acceptable to speak about some of these issues, and we've seen that in the last few years. For instance, right, issues which weren't spoken about for decades finally came out because the environment is more receptive to them than it was 20 years back, and so there's a definite
Yeah.
shift in the environment. The larger cultural environment, I think, across the world. And therefore, you see that with organizations as well, becoming sensitive to a very changed world where, on the one hand, it's harder to keep the lid on misconduct. At the same time, people's expectations are different. They've
Mm-hmm.
shifted. And as you said, they are being supported by at least legal reforms in some places of the world, and those are very progressive places. So, there's hopefully going to be a bit of a rub-off effect. So, Ariella, one of the things I read read about something you said was that you feel stories are far more impactful than, in fact, legal action, and that's why you really help people tell their stories in an effective way, and so that their stories go out. Would you be able to share the example of maybe any one organization where a story finally came out and created a shift in the way the organization was run or managed?
It's a good question. I think that it definitely does a lot for the person who's able to speak and the people who are able to speak. And even if the person, say it's a story about a very abusive CEO, even if that person remains in a position of power, I think people feel vindicated to be able to expose what happened, because it is some form of justice, as opposed to, all right, you go and report it to HR. Who's HR paid by? Like, HR is paid by the CEO. The board definitely has some power to make decisions about the CEO or leadership, but the board also is pretty ingratiated with the CEO usually, and they have to do something. The CEO has to do something totally obscene for the board to want to oust that person. So for people who, and I'm talking about like the most extreme cases, but for people who have been in an abusive relationship with someone who's in leadership, they oftentimes feel like there isn't much that they can do. They feel helpless. They feel like they don't matter. And I think finally when they tell their story, they feel like it matters. People read about it. Who knows how that changes one person's approach to how they interact with their employees, or how they feel empowered to speak out about something in their workplace. I think it just gives people this collective sense of courage and camaraderie, even if they're not in the same organization. And the storyteller who has brought that story forward, I think, feels a lot of, as I said before, vindication. And that, in a way, is just as powerful, I think, than like sweeping organizational change, because the person feels like they matter and they feel like they're heard. I'm trying to think of other examples organizationally, but yeah,
Hi,
that's
Amber.
what I would say.
Hi, sorry for my lateness.
No, welcome to the show. And for those of you who are just joining us, Amber is the other founder of Lioness, and Amber is an author. She's written a book about her whole experience with the Jehovah Witness community, and how she worked with them in China, and then her subsequent experiences moving out of the institution. So she's a really interesting person to follow. Along with Ariella, she's the other founder of Lioness. So Amber, we're just coming to the end of our conversation. And I mean, this is great because we're going to ask you now all the questions that are left for us to discuss. Ariella has just taken us through, really important understanding of how the world itself has shifted, how, some of the norms around what's acceptable and what's not acceptable have shifted, how that's emboldened many people to come out and share their story, how a changing legal environment, particularly, some of the recent reforms, in California have sort of set a different tone for, what might follow in many other parts of the world. She's also spoken about the kind of courage and, the difficulty of actually telling your story because of the disproportionate risk that individuals face as a consequence. And we had a brief conversation around whether the future of work is actually going to be more transparent simply because of many of the technology platforms and just how hard it is to keep a lid on some of this bad news. And that, along with the fact that, at a society level, it's becoming more news about abuse and harassment is finding a more receptive place in society as a whole. So my last question, Amber, is to you. I had followed some research on whistleblowers and their careers, which is old research, actually, I admit about 15 or 20 years back, which shows that whistleblowers actually have a really hard time rebuilding their careers. because often organizations, label them, or industries label them as, people who might create trouble where they go, or, people are just a little uncomfortable. Do you think some of that has shifted?
I think it depends. I think for some people's experience, it's still the same. We were speaking to a lot of people for a guide we did for the Omidyar network that helps whistleblowers when they're coming forward know how to deal with the media. And some of the people we talked to did note that a lot of what we see of whistleblowers feels sometimes glamorous. Like we see this few cases where someone comes forward and it changes, creates a movement, they get a book deal, they're on TV. But very often, she noted that she had been to a day in Washington where they were invited whistleblowers to come in, and many of the people she spoke to, yes, couldn't get a job in their field afterwards, encountered a lot of backlash. So there is a price to pay for whistleblowing. But I do think that we're seeing more and more that companies, because of the shift that you both were speaking about, there are companies that want people in their organization who are known to be people who will hold them to a standard. And also, I kind of think it's almost shifting in a way that it's a good PR move. If you want to show yourself a company that is willing to be open to listen to feedback, then a way to show that as a company is to hire someone who in their field blew the whistle on something that was wrong. So I think there's a shift, and I think people are caring more and more about corporate ethics. And I think that there are more and more companies that want to show proactively that they are going to deal with problems that arise, because there's always going to be problems in companies. It's just the nature of people coming together.
That's such a good point, Amber, that, it might be, in fact, a PR move. I mean, I'm sure there are other reasons also to hire them, but, along with other reasons, there's also this, the fact that you're demonstrating that you are actually an organization which is open to feedback and is against perhaps some of whatever was the kind of misconduct that particular whistleblower, spoke about. So let me come to the last couple of questions then. How do we ensure that employees are aware of their rights? Because if they don't sign an NDA, they don't get jobs.
Oh, I think there's a lot that can happen through, educating yourself. I think a lot of us will get a job and sign the contract without understanding it. So there is some onus on us to understand what we're agreeing to. I definitely agree with that. And we work with lawyers. A lot of lawyers will be willing to, for a small fee or for even free, sometimes give you a pro bono legal advice, read something through. And I think also just having an open conversation with the employer. I mean, if anything, I think it signals to the employer that you're savvy, that if you want to understand that it's a good match with the company. And so I think that there is some proactivity required to make sure that when you sign something that it's something that you're comfortable with.
That's a really good point. So you're saying that it makes sense for employees to be more proactive in at least discussing the terms of their NDA with their employer. And it looks good on both sides, actually, that, this is actually thought out and not just, something that's blueprinted from maybe the past. A final question. Do you feel media plays a big role in bringing about transparency in organizations?
I do. I think that it's, the one means that everyday people have to tell their story in a way that is unfiltered by, corporate talk or this type of thing. And I think that Ariella had a lot of experience with people who worked at companies where there was wrongdoing, and the companies did everything to cover it up because they knew that the court of public opinion was something that they had to worry about. And so I do think that media does have a big role to play, and that's why we formed Lioness too, to try to help people have access to the media, because not everyone knows how to utilize the media or get their story to the media.
I also think that companies can be echo chambers themselves, where people do eat up their own marketing language. And it's understandable. People want to be a part of, they join a company. We were talking to someone from Google the other day, and she was like, I towed the party line. I told everyone how great Google was until something happened to her. And I think being in an organization, you start to believe a lot of what the marketing language is, and whatever the leadership says is the rule of law there. But I think that once you, like, if you really do expose something that's wrong or unjust, it's hard in that climate where everyone is also potentially drinking the Kool-Aid to talk about it. So you almost have to go to an external source, a journalist, or someone outside of the organization to make sense of it and talk about it, and clear your own head and kind of get a gut check. Like, is it strange that this is happening, even though everyone else at the company seems to be thinking the same way? So I think that the media is an important means for people, an outlet for people who previously got swept up in all the corporate speak to be able to, you know, enact change and create some sort of pressure.
I also think that the media, because you find other people, once your story's out there, anyone who's ever had a story, I think, in the media that is something that's connected to the larger culture, that once it's out there, you often will find that you find the people who've had similar experiences. And that can also be empowering. It can also give you more clarity about why something felt wrong and then what needs to change. So there is something about that collective that can come together once a story is in the world, that oftentimes many people that come to us say that they thought they were the only one that had experienced this. And on some level, they knew it was wrong. And so they felt they had to come forward. But then when they came forward, they realized, like, oh, yeah, I'm not the only one this is happening to. And so it becomes a very effective tool of change when it gathers momentum that way.
That is such a good point. That's such a good point. And it's one which perhaps we don't always realize, that people feel alone in these experiences. And the very act of speaking to journalists or media or, you know, your organization helps bring together people who've had a similar experience. And, you know, therefore it helps sort of vindicate their own experience and make it real, that it wasn't just something that they imagined. No, that makes a lot of sense. So with that, we come to the end of our conversation today. I have learned so much. Ariella, Amber, I can't thank you enough. You know, this was a much needed conversation around transparency as it's going to emerge within organizations. Both of you have spoken about some very, very important points. The fact that you know, stories can sometimes be far more effective than legal action. And, you know, you've spoken about the reasons why that's true, why organizations do care about the reputational risks of some of these wrongdoings, how it's actually becoming so much harder to keep some of these hidden because of, you know, social media platforms, organizations like Glassdoor, Vault, your work, and I'm sure there'll be many more which emerge, a changing society level expectation, in some parts a changing legal framework. So we are likely to see organizations become even more careful about not encouraging bad behavior or not, shall I say, not standing by when it occurs, because, you know, perhaps in the future, the risks of some of that are going to become even stronger. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. All those who've joined us today, we're at the end of our conversation today. But on Saturday at noon, Papia and I are having another conversation, which is going to be around the future of skills. It's an Uncube Unplugged show, which means that you can write to us with all your questions. And we're going to be on the air on LinkedIn, taking all your questions around the future of risks. With that, thank you very much and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.